Hello and welcome to the first virtual Common Hour of the semester and Module 3. My name is Rachel Anderson Rayburn and I am the chair of the Common Hour Committee and Associate Professor of Theater. I'd like to introduce our ASL interpreter, Cindy Mees. Thank you, Cindy. We are very happy that all of you are here with us. The Common Hour is an academic program that brings the entire Franklin and Marshall community together weekly for culturally and academically enriching events, and historically, pizza and fruit during the academic year. It is the only regularly scheduled event that brings all of the F&M community together and invites the larger community to join us. We continue our tradition of gathering weekly throughout this pandemic to share this common experience and to continue the conversations after Common Hour ends. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the Common Hour Committee, I would like to announce that the committee will be accepting proposals from faculty, staff, and students for the Fall 21 Virtual Common Hour up until Monday, March 22nd. Please refer to the Common Hour web pages and a forthcoming email for links to the proposal form and FAQ. You can also check the chat right now. Students must partner with a faculty or a staff member to co-propose an event. We encourage you to consider submitting talks that you might be planning as department events, as Common Hour events. Next week's Common Hour was proposed by Nina Bond and will feature Ramsey Kassim with a talk entitled Rebellious Lawyering Against the U.S. Security State, From the Street to the Supreme Court. For our Zoom viewers, please ask any questions that you have following the talk via the Q&A feature, not the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen, and please do identify whether you are FPS or a student. Last but not least, our featured virtual pizza server group today is the Deaf and Disabled Student Union, whose purpose is to create a space for conversation, community, acceptance, support, and activism, specifically in regards to deafness and disability. The DDSU provides a space for students to actively address concerns and frustrations in regard to deafness, disability, and access. We invite you to join us for a panel event about supporting students with disabilities on April 4th at 4 p.m. Thank you, DDSU. And now I'd like to introduce the proposer of today's event, Professor Maria Mitchell from F&M's History Department.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I am speaking not only as a member of the History Department, but also as a proud member of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And it's my privilege and pleasure today to introduce Margaret Price, Associate Professor of English and Director of the Disability Studies Program at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Professor Price first came to us on the recommendation of our own Professor Meg Day from the English department to participate in our curriculum symposium in August 2019, where her contributions were so well received that we committed to inviting her back. She now returns to us with the generous support of Brooks College House, the departments of English and Italian and Hebrew, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the programs in public health and women's gender and sexuality studies, student accessibility services, and Writers House. A specialist in rhetoric and composition, Margaret earned an MFA from the University of Michigan and a PhD from the University of Massachusetts. Her first book, Mad at School, Rhetorics of Mental Disability in Academic Life, won the Outstanding Book Award from the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Her current project, CRIP Spacetime, forthcoming with Duke University Press, explores the experiences of disabled faculty and access issues in higher education. In 2020, she was granted a Fulbright Research Award, which she hopes will someday soon take her to Sweden. A member of the Susan M. Daniels Disability Mentoring Hall of Fame, Professor Price is co-founder and lead PI of the Transformative Access Project at The Ohio State University, which reimagines access as a collective process that centers race, ethnicity, disability, class, gender, and sexuality. Her award-winning research focuses on sharing concrete strategies and starting necessary dialogues about creating a culture of care and a sense of shared accountability in academic spaces. Noting that the phrases culture of care and shared accountability have often been co-opted in ways that unfortunately mean more photo ops, less compensation for marginalized people, she seeks to guide us through the difficult questions that lead ultimately to a campus culture with greater access for all. In that spirit, she will address us today on everyday survival and collective action, what we can learn from disabled workers in higher education. Professor Price, thank you for coming and being part of Common Hour.
Hello. I'm changing the order of some of my beginning things because of Zoom. First of all, I want to say I am so honored to be part of this series. As Maria mentioned, I visited Franklin and Marshall in 2019, and I truly appreciated how warm and responsive everyone was. It made me miss teaching at a small college, which I did for 12 years before I changed jobs and went to Ohio State. I genuinely wish I could be there in person. And I would like to say, as someone with agoraphobia, mental illnesses, cognitive disabilities, and a mobility impairment, I do not say that lightly. I really wish I could be there in person. I am very happy to be able to connect with you again today. Before I start my PowerPoint, I want to offer a couple of positioning notes. First, please do whatever you'd like to do that helps make this workshop more accessible for you. As you wish, please move around, turn your camera off as needed, stim, fidget, and so on. You may observe me standing up and sitting down while I'm speaking. I might pause to check in with our interpreter today to see where she's at. I might even briefly interact with my dog, who is here in the room with me. In fact, I didn't anticipate this, but today I have two dogs with me. And for those who are sighted, I'm lowering my screen. There's a larger black dog passed out on the floor, and less easy to see in a little blue bed, there's a tiny brown chihuahua. So they're part of this presentation as well. I'm a white genderqueer person. My pronouns are she and her. I have gray hair and glasses. And today I have a shelf of green plants off to my left and a white bookcase behind me. Where I stand, I'm occupying the ancestral and contemporary territory of a number of different First Nations, each of which I'll spell in turn. These nations and tribes include the Shawnee, Shawnee, Potawatomi, Potawatomi, Delaware, Delaware, Miami, Miami, Peoria, Peoria, Seneca, Seneca, Wyandotte, Wyandotte, Ojibwe, Ojibwe, and Cherokee, Cherokee. In saying this, I'm recognizing not only ancestral ties to this land, but also the ongoing work of the tribal nations connected to this land. And this includes the work of some of the people at OSU who have taught me many of the things that I want to talk about today. These folks include Dr. Ballengee Morris, Ballengee Morris, and Dr. Beard Jacob, Beard-Jacob. They have both taught me that acknowledging land occupation doesn't just mean being accountable to history. It also means working in solidarity in the present. I've just shared my screen, and so we might need to pause briefly to ensure that people can access the PowerPoint and also both access, if they wish, me and the interpreter. I'm going to pause briefly so that people have a chance to drop any concerns that they have in the Q&A if that's necessary, which I can't see happening. So I'm just taking it on faith that the wonderful organizers of the Common Hour are jumping on those concerns that they're coming up. The slide that I've just put on the screen gives the title of this talk and also includes a graphic. This is from an article that I clipped from the Arkansas Times in December. The graphic is a comic showing about 50 people standing in a long winding line. At the head of the line is a person labeled healthcare worker. Near the end of the line are people labeled prisoners and young adults. And right in the middle of the line is a red silhouette of a person who's labeled you. I'll return to this graphic and its significance in terms of accountability in just a few minutes. Ooh, look at that. My key ideas and questions today are on the slide that I've put up. Essentially, my goal is to talk about what it means to achieve well-being in higher education. For all of us in higher education, students, faculty, staff, everyone associated with this endeavor. That question was already pressing before the advent of COVID-19, and it's now even more urgent. My own personal research focuses on disability in higher education, with a special focus on the spaces, customs, and norms of higher ed. And according to this research, I just like to give away the main finding at the beginning. Like, here's the big takeaway. Individual solutions will never move us closer to sustainable well-being. By individual solutions, I mean, for example, accommodations intended to address the so-called problem of just one disabled person. Or, for example, programs that encourage students or employees to attend to self-care as a mean of being more well. These sorts of individual measures are important. I'm not advocating for abandoning them. But I also want to point out that they have the effect of digging grooves into the pathways of our system, our individual orientation, and they have the effect of turning our attention away from things like structures, relations, and accountability. And so I also come to you today with a question. This is not a question I've answered very well for myself yet, but it's one that over the course of my research, I've become convinced is incredibly important. The question is, what does it mean to practice accountability? I'm pausing here just in case I need to be interrupted for anything that's not going well on our audience's end. All right, forging on. I'm now returning to the graphic from the cover slide. This graphic, again from the Arkansas Times, was used to illustrate a report on a tool that was released by the New York Times on December 3rd, 2020. The New York Times piece was headlined, "Find Your Place in the Vaccine Line." And it also showed a graphic of people in line. Although in the case of the New York Times, they only had 5 people in line. And I was immediately distracted and sort of charmed to observe that one of the people in line is wearing an enormous puffer coat, perhaps because they knew the Arctic blast was coming. Now, the tool that is advertised in this particular piece from the New York Times is a fill-in-the-blank calculator that's designed to figure out, as the article said, where you might fit in that line for getting the vaccine. Unfortunately, the author of the tool, not to mention all of his editors at the New York Times, seem to have missed the fact that that's not actually how vaccines work. Escaping the devastation of COVID-19 is about epidemiology. It's about groups. It's not about individual immunity. Even if you believe the vaccine is a kind of cloak of invisibility, protecting you from all forms of COVID-19 forever, P.S., it's not, the line image is still astonishing in its ability to mislead. Over the next several days after this article came out in the New York Times, dozens of my friends posted on social media about having used the calculator and figured out their own places in line. I tell this story because it's such a sharp analogy for the ways that we in higher education tend to think about our own fate. Everything tells us to believe that we are in a line, and so we fail to realize that we're actually in a herd. Now, when I visited Franklin and Marshall in 2019, I shared some findings from the study that I'm working on now. It's a survey and interview study of disabled faculty members in higher education. What's on the screen now is a slide with a graphic of the study's website and a very quick summary of what the study has involved. I started it in 2012. It began with a large quantitative survey and then moved to semi-structured interviews. And if you'd like to read more about the study, you can visit my website. I'll spell out the URL. It's http:// Price, all one word, /wordpress.com/disabled-faculty-study. It's also pretty easy to find by Google at this point. However, do include the word disabled or you might get the opera singer Margaret Price. I hope everyone's laughing loudly because I really miss hearing people laugh when I give talks. Now, when I was speaking at Franklin and Marshall in 2019, I mentioned that I began this study 8 years ago with a very concrete and a utilitarian aim in mind. I already knew that conditions in higher education for disabled faculty, not to mention other workers, including staff and graduate students, were pretty terrible. I knew this because I am disabled, and I have a large community of friends in higher ed who are also disabled. We spend quite a bit of time reaching out to each other about issues with access in our jobs. Sometimes we're trying to help and support each other, and sometimes we're just complaining about the latest baffling situation or random atrocity. When I started this study, what I was after were what are called hard data, or sometimes gold standard research. That is numerically driven, evidence-based research that I could use to help convince administrators and policymakers to make serious moves toward access for their employees. I wanted statistics. I wanted clear examples that repeated across situations through a wide variety of schools. And I wanted to be persuasive to audiences who tend to be most convinced by numbers. I was, I think, fairly successful in that effort. And a lot of what I was talking about the last time I was at Franklin and Marshall is the results that the survey and some of the early publications of the study have the effects they've had. However, interestingly, something else happened along the way. As I've analyzed the hundreds of survey responses and the dozens of hours of interviews that we, the study team, collected, I've come to realize that my close focus on disabled faculty has also opened up larger themes that concern everyone's access in academic life, not just faculty. The key themes that are now shaping the book I'm writing are these: time, space, cost, and accompaniment/relationships. In qualitative coding, those overarching themes are sometimes called dimensions. And each of these dimensions, these 4 dimensions, are divided into subcategories, which are also called codes. Now, the main theme that I'm exploring today is the third one, which is bolded here. It's cost. And I'm highlighting the theme of cost because it gets us toward talking, I think, the more sticky issue that I've really become preoccupied with over the course of this study, which is the question of accountability. My brief talk today has 3 sections. First, I'm offering a brief exploration of cost in higher education as understood through the experiences of disabled faculty members. I'll second offer a close look at one aspect of cost, that is one code that I developed when looking at cost. And that code is titled Distribution, or Who Pays for What. And finally, I'll talk a bit about what we might actually do with this knowledge to try to create a more equitable, a more just college, university, maybe even higher education system in general. So first, just a short introduction into the many things that cost can mean in higher education. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, events in higher ed, such as classes, lectures, meetings, tended to be designed on the assumption that most of us would interact face-to-face with ease. So requests by disabled people for aids like interpreters, accessible lighting, automatic door openers, these were generally met with suspicion or concern. And the concern, of course, was how much such measures would cost. Now, cost in those situations is framed as financial cost, and the amount of money required is understood to be high or low based on an array of contextual factors, including not only existing budgets and precedent, but also sometimes humiliating rituals. For example, when a disabled faculty member needs a particular accommodation, they are often required to demonstrate how badly they need it. And in a paradoxical move, they are often also required to demonstrate that despite desperately needing this accommodation, they are nevertheless excellent at their job. Numerous faculty members in the study commented on this paradox, and I have to say it's a very tough one to be in. Now, before the advent of the pandemic, mainstream academic discourse rarely mentioned other kinds of costs in higher education, such as the physical, emotional, and cognitive costs of simply getting to work or functioning at work. Of course, the pandemic then turned those tables. Now, Zoom fatigue is a familiar phrase, and it seems that the whole world suddenly understands that time can be both difficult and exhausting to account for. I'm now going to share one of my favorite graphics coming out of late 2020. On the screen now is an image that you may have seen passed around social media. This is a mock calendar page titled Gentemporary 2020-01. There are 42 days in this mock month and 8 days in each week. The days of the week include 2 Mondays, Semi-Friday, and Pizza Night. I love this image. I love it because it's funny, but I also love it because it signals widespread recognition that when one is under unbearable stress, both time and effort begin to twist. In response to that recognition, in higher education, attention and money have flowed generously toward ensuring that our work can take place online. We also have begun to recognize more readily now that making another person sick can be terribly costly, not only for them as an individual, but for the medical system as a whole. In short, disabled people everywhere are finding our experience abruptly recognized and even respected. Look at all these skills we have. Look at all this knowledge we have about being unwell. However, once again, we are also disregarded wholesale, as the well world seems to be intent upon reinventing the wheel again and again. Screens make you tired. Who knew? We knew. Now, disabled academics have written a number of pieces pointing out that this so-called new normal is in fact the old normal for many of us. And yet, despite all the changes of the past year, fundamental patterns around cost remain largely intact. For example, my university, Ohio State, set aside a large fund for internal grants up to $50,000 per team, dedicated to projects that focus on COVID and racial justice. No problem, right? Good thing. Yay, internal grants, more money, racial justice. Good, good, good. However, note that these funds are offered for additional work and that the grant money is available only through a competitive process. So those who one might hope would benefit from these funds, for example, people of color, disabled people, they are asked to do yet more work and compete harder in the name of redressing inequity. Furthermore, in this particular example, and I know this because I applied for one of the grants with a team of fellow faculty members and staff, we were told in the process of application that we could not include a line item in our budget for release time. We could only include items for things like materials, research assistance, imaginary travel, stuff like that. Basically, we couldn't have more time. And on our small team, which was led by 2 women of color, we realized that we were already all so overburdened by virtue of our positions as minoritized faculty members, there was no way we could feasibly carry out one of these grants, even if we were awarded the money. We wrote to the office to protest, and we were informed that they would look into it. 2 months later, that was this past November, we were told that they had changed the rule. Now faculty teams applying for these grants could apply for release time as well. However, and they encouraged us to apply again because the next cycle of grants would start in January. However, I got to tell you, January, now I'm talking about just 2 weeks ago, none of us had any extra time or energy. One of our potential PIs had small children at home. One had very recently lost a beloved relative to COVID. I'm offering this example because the costs of time and ignorance are often considered neutral. That is, if the mistake is fixed and no one meant to do any harm, everything is considered to be okay going forward. However, this example shows that sometimes the people who bore the costs of that delay, that exchange, that negotiation, sometimes those people are no longer able to go forward. And that too is a cost. The thoughts I'm sharing today are drawn in part from my experiences over the last year, but they're also dramatically influenced by the dozens of hours of faculty interviews that I've been analyzing over the past 7 years. As I mentioned, my coding process eventually culminated in 4 dimensions: time, space, cost, and accompaniment relationships. And within each dimension, I identified a number of codes. The coding of cost includes the following subcodes, and these are listed verbatim on the slide that I've just put up. The subcodes for cost include distribution, who pays for what, financial cost, emotional cost, negotiation, trade-offs, often framed as cost benefit, and use of personal resources. Now, this is only 6 of the codes within cost, which actually has more like 18 or 20 codes. And each of the other dimensions also has a wide array of codes, each of which is carefully defined in a coding scheme. I'm kind of holding myself back from going into tremendous detail about my analytical process. But for any methodology nerds out there, I'm happy to talk about it more during our discussion period. For now, I'll just skip right to the first code under cost, which is what I want to focus on in the next section. This is the code distribution, or who pays for what. Disabled faculty who receive documented accommodations from their institutions often talk about the problem of who pays for what. It's ordinary for the cost of a faculty member's accommodations to be drawn from a departmental budget rather than being paid for by a larger entity at the school. If the department is small, that cost can be severely limiting. One interviewee, whose pseudonym is Iris, I-R-I-S, she identifies as a queer white faculty member at a public university. Iris described facing the situation when she started a new job as an assistant professor. And the negotiation that she's describing in the quotation I'm about to read you took place during her job negotiation, when she was also negotiating salary, benefits, and startup funds. So I will read you the quote from Iris, which is also written verbatim on the next slide. She said, "After requesting accommodations, I got this very official signed letter from the dean saying, here's the accommodations and here's who's going to be paying for each of them. Which ones would be the department's responsibility and which ones the college would pay for. Because the expensive thing I asked for is a graduate assistant to do things like get books from the library, do photocopying, and just tasks like that. And so, that would have been a lot to ask my department to cover that cost because it's a small department." Now, for those unfamiliar with negotiating for disability accommodations, it might seem foolish to bring up this issue at the same time that factors such as salary are also in play. After all, your institution is required to accommodate you if you're disabled. They're not required to pay you any particular salary. However, according to the disabled faculty study and also the sparse existing literature on disabled faculty, accommodations are incredibly difficult to come by despite the fact that they are legally mandated. And so on a practical level, it makes sense to pin down accommodations at the only time one has bargaining power, that is, before one is hired. Unfortunately, very few disabled faculty members realize this at the time of their job negotiations. Or in some cases, when they are hired, they don't need accommodations, but later they do need them. Iris is an unusually savvy negotiator. And when she was hired, she was already aware that she needed to try to protect her department from the burden of cost that could be laid upon them. But most faculty I interviewed who were receiving accommodations reported that that issue came as a surprise. They found themselves in the position of appearing to take money away from their departmental colleagues. So here's an example of that happening. Another interviewee, a straight white woman whose pseudonym is Kelly, told a story about having been the last deaf graduate student in her program. Here's the story in Kelly's words. And again, here I'm reading verbatim off the slide. "At the school where I'm now a professor, I've talked to disability support services about interpreters, but they have said that the money for that comes from the department. Yeah, so what DSS has said, and this is something that I'm very sensitive to because I dealt with this in my graduate career, is that there's the department, so DSS will facilitate the request, right? DSS will go to the department and say, you have a faculty person who wants, an interpreter. It's a reasonable accommodation, you have to grant it. In other words, the setup at Kelly's school was the disability support services would advocate for her as a faculty member, which actually is rare. Usually disability support services serve students and not faculty. But they wouldn't actually do anything about shifting the burden of cost. They would simply say to the department more loudly, you have to pay for this accommodation. I then asked Kelly as her interviewer what she meant by having dealt with this in her graduate career, and she elaborated. In my graduate education, I had my advisor tell me that they weren't going to take another deaf student because having deaf students was too expensive, While interviewing her, I reacted by saying, what a horrible thing to say. But Kelly explained that actually her advisor was a strong ally of hers, who was commiserating with her at the time about how ableist the department was in general. Although he himself was a tenured professor, he felt helpless to intervene in the structure that was already set up. I'll say just one other thing about this particular code distribution, which is this. When faculty members are in a position to have their accommodations paid for by the institution as a whole, rather than a smaller department or program, unfortunately, that's not always a blessing. For some faculty members in this study, negotiating with the accommodation meant that the full resources and impersonal attitude of the institution itself was arrayed against them. When a person representing the entire school, such as a human resources employee or an ADA specialist, this meant that the discourse often shifted away from what the employee needed and toward a cost-benefit analysis and a legal framework. One interviewee named Miyoko, Miyoko, a straight woman of color who had tenure at her institution, asked for accommodations in the spring of one of her first years as a tenured professor. She asked for the accommodations in the spring because she wanted to give herself several months lead time for teaching that was coming up in the fall. She prepared her request letter with care and checked it with the support office. And here I'm reading verbatim from Miyoko's interview. I remember I took the draft of my letter to show them, and they looked at it and they were like, oh, this is excellent. Like, you've written everything down. It seems reasonable. Just go ahead and send the letter. So that's what I did. I waited almost a month, I think, and I got a letter back from HR by, what do you call that, certified delivery, where I had to sign that I got it. It was clearly a letter that had been written by a lawyer saying that they needed medical documentation. And yeah, it was quite a surprise. As the negotiation over Miyoko's requests dragged on throughout that summer, her school's HR office insisted on holding the entire conversation by certified US mail. This is despite the fact that Miyoko repeatedly offered to use email, telephone, or in-person meetings instead. The process was so slow that the accommodations had not been granted by the time fall came, and Miyoko was simply not able to keep working. She gave up her tenured position 7 months after initiating that first request. This is actually a longer, more involved story involving more kind of appalling, unbelievable situations. And I've recently written an article called Time Harms that details Miyoko's story in more detail. When I have access to the chat again, I'm happy to drop the information for that article in the chat. So Miyoko's story is long and even more complicated than what's detailed here. But the point I want to take away is that the people involved in this negotiation were calculating costs in radically different ways that resulted in serious harm to Miyoko. The school was thinking about cost in terms of liability. Miyoko was thinking about cost in terms of the impossible demands being placed on her body. And ultimately, this whole exchange resulted in a cost to Miyoko, which might be almost unimaginable to those who have gone through the labor of achieving tenure. She simply gave it up and she left academia. I've now reached kind of a familiar point in this talk, or in my talks in general, which is the point where I've really bummed everybody out. Like, I often spend about 15 minutes delivering really terrible news. And then I sort of try to bring it back up, like, okay, what are we going to do about it? So the last things that I want to say are about what do we do with this? What do we make of it? Because for all its flaws, I still believe in higher education as a site of creativity, collaboration, resistance, and even of love. I still believe in it as a place where we make each other better, not just intellectually, but in all ways. And by better, I don't mean higher achieving. I mean that we can thrive together. And so we arrive at the question that I've been grappling with for a long time now. What does it actually mean to practice accountability, to make each other better in the sense of thriving, not in the sense of individual achievement? Over the years of this study, it's become obvious that there are rarely individual villains involved. Maybe the occasional mean dean or cruel department chair. The thing is, most people in higher education want to do well by each other, want to practice equity and justice. We are, in fact, the proverbial well-meaning people, the well-meaning white people, the well-meaning middle-class people, the well-meaning straight people, the well-meaning non-disabled people. The problem is structure, and the problem is discourse. We want things to be better, but we don't actually want to be accountable. The who pays for what code exposes that lack of accountability. We hear echoes of it everywhere in the discourses of disability cost. And this list of questions and statements, I'm reading verbatim off the slide. I thought HR took care of that. Isn't disability services in charge of that? Your department chair can help you with that. We can't get you an automatic door opener, but you can always ask a student to help you with the door. And of course, the infamous passive voice, mistakes were made, your request has been denied. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve deeply into recent scholarship on accountability. I will say that it has garnered significant interest in recent years, especially in feminist philosophy and science and technology studies. Again, happy to geek out during the Q&A as needed. But I want to talk about right now is ways that we might start a conversation about this or just reflect on this in our own locations where we are right now. Accountability moves will look different in every location. And that's part of the point of collective accountability. There is no set recipe. There is no checklist for achieving it. We can, however, draw upon examples, both those that are cited in published accounts and those that I've drawn from the Disabled Faculty Study. I've learned both through research and by paying attention to the interviews conducted that accountability is practiced in higher education, and there are some recognizable moves. On the next slide, I list out some of those recognizable moves. This is by no means an exhaustive list. And let's see, I don't think I have time to go into a long example of each of these, so I'll just kind of present each of these moves. Again, I'm happy to offer more examples if people would like to talk about, well, what is an example of that? What would that look like? So some of the predictable moves that I've begun to recognize over the course of my research are these. First, believing an expression of need without questioning it, without asking for evidence, just believing it. Somebody says, I need this thing, you just say, I believe you need that. So what we're talking about is how to do it. We are skipping over the part about why you need it. Another way of practicing accountability is to make things your problem. A lot of problems float by when you work in higher education, all day, every day. You don't have to make them all your problem, but make more things your problem. Another possible move is to inquire what is really meant when someone says something is impossible. Sometimes what is meant is that's not possible within the current structure or within the current set of assumptions. As we all know, things are often impossible according to a budget, but then magically some other money is found elsewhere. So I recommend that we regard the notion of impossibility with the what Tanya Tichkowsky has called a politics of wonder. Tichkowsky is spelled T-I-T-C-H-K-O-S-K-Y. The politics of wonder is a way of not fighting back against the assertion, not saying, no, it is possible, but instead going at it from the angle of saying, what does impossible mean in this specific context right now? And finally, a predictable move in spaces that practice collective accountability, or where you can see accountability happening between people, is people tend to move as a group instead of as individuals. And they tend to be guided by a precept, which was expressed by Mia Mingus, M-I-N-G-U-S, as, if you can't go, I don't want to go. Now, again, I haven't offered concrete examples for these because I want us to have plenty of discussion time, and I am happy to offer examples. But I also want to emphasize that I'm offering these less as directions for how you should behave and more as thought experiments. Can you stop and think through what it might be like if you applied one of these ideas in a specific situation that confronts you this week, maybe even later today? Can you notice your own position when you engage in that thought experiment? For example, Are you a person who's been trained to believe that things are generally not your problem? I'm white. I was raised white, and I was trained to believe that most things aren't really my problem because they don't have to be. If moving as a group seems difficult, if you find yourself waiting for someone or pausing for a long time, or perhaps feeling impatient that things are not moving as quickly as you could move, think about what costs are being required of you. And finally, think about the key question, who do you already consider yourself accountable to? Why? I've been working in critical university studies for a long time now. I'm honestly not sure what sorts of changes are possible, or at what scale, or how fast. But I do know this. We must begin moving in ways that assume not just some of us are vulnerable, but that all of us are vulnerable. We must assume that we are all accountable to each other, accountable in immediate ways, in life and death ways. If we didn't learn that from the past year, then we learn nothing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation. There's so much to dig into here, and so much to ask about and learn more about. I'll just start with kind of a general question while we wait for some folks to use the Q&A function to add to our list of things to discuss with you. I wonder what you're talking about in terms of the accountability moves. It feels like, it sounds like an ethics. It sounds like committing to an ethics as a community. It sounds like creating ways of treating one another as community. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about ways in which you could consider that a politics. I'm thinking in terms of your invocation of the phrase politics of wonder.
Yes, yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting way to think about it. Committing to an ethics, I think, is something that a lot of us are able to do over time, but I think that it also can be hard to think about taking up something as a framework. So this is one reason why I'm such a big fan of what's something you could do today, what's something you could try out or just kind of get stuck in your mind. It absolutely is a politics, and you can see it in gatherings where there's a lot of disabled people together, a lot of BIPOC people together. That acronym is BIPOC. You can see this kind of interdependent politics at work. For example, while I was spelling the names of various indigenous nations near the beginning of this talk, I started to feel really embarrassed. I actually hadn't prepared a version of this talk for our interpreter that had those spelled out. I forgot that I had them on a slide, which would have been convenient to remember. And I just sat there spelling for a long time. And I couldn't tell if people were getting impatient, and I couldn't really tell if people thought this was getting kind of stupid. And I was just kind of launched into it, feeling discomfort. When I'm in groups of disabled people or in disability justice circles, there's kind of a working assumption that we could run into weird, awkward delays at any moment. And almost anything could bring them about. Somebody might say, I need to turn off the lights in here. And then someone else might say, oops, I need the light on for my sight lines. And then there's just going to be an awkward delay while that gets figured out. Or somebody might, again, realize they didn't have things spelled out on a slide and stand there spelling for minutes on end. This is much more something that I sort of feel than something I could empirically observe. But in gatherings that bring together people who practice accountability in that specific way, that is a shared accountability for allowing time to be really wonky, or as it's sometimes called, CRIP time, CRIP time, you can just notice a sense of everyone being like, yeah, that's happening. It's not a big deal. We've seen it before. We'll see it again. And it's very much a sense that the group together is engaging in this sort of timing because we are accountable to one another. It's incredibly hard to describe, and it's very hard to explain if you haven't been in a situation like that, which is one reason why I like to remind people, all of us have experienced shared accountability. We just have to think about the context where it's familiar to us. It might be the context of a family. It might be the context of a group of friends. We know what it feels like, but we are not accustomed to thinking of it as something that could or should be applied in other contexts than the ones we already apply it in.
Thank you. I have a question from a faculty member. And they ask, what steps should or might a department take as they embark on a search to fill an open faculty position to ensure that any potential hire will receive the accommodations they need?
I have written about this.
Excellent.
I'm trying to think what would be most useful. Well, I wrote like an angry short piece for Inside Higher Education in 2011. That piece is titled, "It Shouldn't Be So Hard." And it's specifically about the interview process. But there's a more far-reaching and broadly applicable position statement that I had a hand in writing for the Conference on College Composition and Communication. And it's a position statement titled, I think we ended up calling it a best practices document, best practices on hiring tenure track and non-tenure track faculty. And it covers a lot of basic access moves that you'll see in other professional societies documents. For example, the Modern Language Association has a pretty good set of guidelines. But then it also covers some other things that our task force added from personal experience, just little things like if you're interviewing in a hotel, realize that people might be having a lot of trouble navigating. If you are, especially salient now, if you're interviewing remotely, make sure that people are getting extra cues about who is who. People might want to say their names before they speak, or repeat context about who is who more often. So that's part of my ongoing effort, which is honestly a very vexed effort, to take my philosophical insights and try to make them practical through things like policy statements. I never wanted to be a policy wonk, but it's also impossible for me to propose that we do wonderful things without also asking the question, so what would that actually look like in everyday life? So I did happen to co-author this particular piece of policy.
Thank you. This is from another faculty member. This question is, what role does accountability play in feminist philosophy and in science, technological, and society studies? What insights does each of those fields bring to accountability?
Yes, thank you. This is something I offered to nerd out about a little bit. And I should emphasize that others have written about this in both feminist philosophy and in science and technology studies, much better than I have. The conversation about responsibility, and that's the word response hyphen and then the word ability, was begun loosely around 2008 when Karen Barad published Meeting the Universe Halfway. She actually published it in 2007. Barad is B-A-R-A-D. And Donna Haraway, H-A-R-A-W-A-Y, published a book called When Species Meet. I believe it was Haraway who actually coined the term. Oh, sorry, I'm sharing helpful spellings with the panelists only. I believe it was Haraway who coined the term responsibility, and it was then taken up and explored in feminist science studies. And there have been some really interesting studies of the ways that environments and organisms and biological systems seem to practice accountability toward one another. Now, I'm going to write this out just for myself.
You can write it wherever you want, and we
Oh,
will copy and paste it and get it to everybody.
There's a relatively recent book by Eva Haifa-Girard, Eva-Haifa-Garaud, called Beyond, I believe it's called Beyond Entanglement. And it has a really useful section that parses the different responses to and approaches to accountability, particularly in feminist philosophy and feminist science studies. Now, Girard is one of the only authors I've seen who makes a move that I consider crucial, which is to say, okay, what do we do besides calling for accountability? This is a really big bone I have to pick with a lot of philosophy writing, which is possibly missing the point of philosophy. Someone will say, accountability is the way of the future, the end. And I love Girard's book because she looks at specific examples of groups of activists and other specific social circles in which accountability works according to various models. There's also a book I'm trying to look at. Yeah, I'm going to grab a book off my bookshelf. See, this is something you can't do when you're giving a talk that you've traveled to. So grab your book and hold it up to your camera. I'm holding up a book titled Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. And this book is actually edited by Ejeris Dixon, Ejeris Dixon, and Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samarasinha. First name Leah, Leah, second name Lakshmi, Lakshmi, last name Piepzna hyphen Samarasinha. Now, transformative justice is a movement that has to do practicing accountability in a very specific way within a specific community. And it takes as one of its baseline assumptions that harms should be redressed within community, but also that part of movement building is redressing harm. There has been a long tradition of sort of holding movements separate from notions like healing and repairing harm. And transformative justice argues that those two moves are one and the same. To build an activist movement, you are also always repairing harm. The stories in this book show different ways that transformative justice plays out in different situations. It's not easy. It's not simple. It's a very messy process. And I also want to mention that there's been a disturbing trend recently of picking up both disability justice and transformative justice kind of wholesale as concepts and announcing that they are being applied to higher education in different ways. An example of this is that a professional society I belong to literally just yesterday sent out a call for a transformative justice officer. Now, like most professional societies, this society is majority white, and it's firmly within academe. I'm very concerned about ways that we might claim to be doing transformative justice within these settings. That's sort of a side issue, but it feels important. In response to the questioner's question, I think transformative justice is an incredibly important model to learn from and think about how principles from it might be applied. But again, it's important not to say, oh, I learned how to do transformative justice and now I'm a provost and I'm doing it at my school, because it's more complicated than that.
So we have, I think, time for only one more question. I'm so sorry. We're in our last minute or two. So
I knew the common hour was a sprint.
It's a sprint. Get ready to go super fast. So this last question will actually connect to some of those ideals or sort of offer up some different ways into it potentially. So this is an anonymous question. And the question is this: In a time where tuition costs are skyrocketing and leaving low-income students out in the cold, how can institutions justify any new expenses, no matter how morally necessary they may be?
That's an incredibly important question. And I think it gets to, I think it is a way of phrasing the question, when people are dying, why would we be funding anything other than helping people not die? I honestly don't know the answer. I think the real answer, the practical answer, is that people are doing their best as they go. And the work of helping people not die doesn't always look like direct application of monetary costs, although it should partly look like that. I think a really important, it's not a solution to this really good question, but it is a way of thinking about it. When people are in desperate need, for example, if students cannot afford to stay in school, if students can't afford to eat when they're in school, for example, if students can't afford to buy warm clothes when they're trying to get to their classes, that's a really important occasion on which to provide support in ways that doesn't ask questions, doesn't ask for justifications, and doesn't require more work. A weird thing that higher education does is I think it tends to try to offer money and support to its vulnerable populations, but then say, and you have to write an essay to get this, or we're going to have a negotiation with you about how much you need this. And one of the arguments I'm making in favor of shared accountability is, if you are in a position where that kind of distribution is happening, just try the thought experiment of what would happen if you just didn't ask those questions. You still come up on really hard policy decisions. For example, are funds distributed first come, first serve? How are these processes actually even, how is any decision or any kind of way to move forward a part of this process? But those things are worth thinking about, because our automatic response of asking people to apply for things is also a way of saying, we want you to work for this support. And I think it's worth thinking in higher education about what it means to support without additional labor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price. It's been a lovely sprint. Thank you very much for coming back and being with us again at FNM.
Oh, thank you all so much for welcoming me. It's been an absolute delight. I wish I could see everyone, but I'll imagine we're all applauding together.
Everyone is applauding, laughing, and making appropriate facial expressions.
Yeah, and there's
right.
animals
Thank
and
you
all
so
that.
much.
All right, take care.
Take care. Thanks for
Bye.
joining.